Now, this first unit, we're going to be looking primarily, the first unit, and indeed probably the second unit, just as I said, this is primarily a military history course. In the first couple of units, we are going to be looking primarily at political matters, because we're going to be discussing how the war begins, which is very important. And what we're going to do is, what we're going to start with in this first unit is we're going to look at the rise of the totalitarian states around the world. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the rise of totalitarian Japan, of Italy, of the Soviet Union, and of Nazi Germany. So we're going to go ahead and kind of look at the development of these countries that kind of make them more militarized, more fascist or communist, and why that is, and kind of what the significance of that's going to be. And then in our next unit, we're actually going to be looking at how the war actually begins. But we're going to start by looking at Japan. Japan, we got to go to understand like Japan and why it's going to do the things it's going to do. We have to look all the way back to the 17th century. Okay, in the 17th century, Japanese society had been destabilized because Japan had this society. Japan had this feudal society. Essentially, they had samurai instead of knights, but it's kind of the same thing. And they had lords and nobles, right, daimyos. And their kind of feudalism means you're always kind of in this state of low-level warfare, right? And that's what was going on throughout Japan. But in the 17th century, the 1600s, something is introduced into Japan from outside of Japan: Christianity and Westernism generally. When the Christian Bible arrives in Japan, and many Japanese begin to convert to Christians, as I say, it starts to destabilize Japanese society significantly. And so the Japanese answer to this was to essentially close off Japan to Westerners. The Japanese become a xenophobic society. Okay, they essentially closed their borders. They allowed for a couple of trading ports with Portuguese and Dutch traders around Nagasaki, in Nagasaki Harbor. But generally, for nearly 200 years, if a foreigner, specifically if a European, were to land anywhere in Japan, they would either be killed or, at sword point, driven back into the sea, which amounts to the same thing. So Japan was closed for nearly 200 years. It was a xenophobic society. Well, and then something happens in 1853. In 1853, the United States decides it wants to begin trade with China. The problem is, if you're going to trade with China, you need coaling stations. You need places where your ships can refuel. And it was decided, well, we need to talk the Japanese into letting us refuel there. So we sent an admiral to Japan named Matthew C. Perry. And Matthew C. Perry goes to Japan, and more or less at gunpoint, he tells the Japanese, you're going to trade with us, you're going to open your ports to us, and we are going to have a trade treaty, essentially. We're going to have a treaty of friendship here. He came with, the ships he had, these vast warships he had. He actually fired guns in the harbor, not at anything, but just to show the Japanese how powerful they were. He came ashore in Japan with 15 launches. He had about 100 Marines that came with him. He had musicians, a band with him. He's trying to overawe and impress the Japanese with American force here. The next year, the year after he lands there, you have a treaty that is signed between the Japanese and the United States called the Treaty of Kanagawa. And this essentially, it does a lot of things here. I'm not going to get into everything. We don't need to, but this kind of opens up Japan. Japan is kind of open for business after this. Now, here's the thing. The Japanese were so overawed by the Americans and humiliated, frankly, by the Americans because they couldn't stand up to them. The Japanese are going to start to think, well, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? How can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And indeed, as Japan is looking at the rest of Asia and the Pacific, and they're seeing the European powers conquer these territories and in some cases colonize them, the Japanese are thinking, how are they going to come for us? Are they going to do that to us? How can we stop them? So the Japanese are going to start looking at ways to make sure that never happens. Now, one of the things they do in 1862, they send a small fleet to a tiny island not far from Japan called Chichijima. Some Americans had actually already started a colony on Chichijima, but the Japanese arrive and they say, we are claiming this colony for Japan. Now, why don't the Americans respond? Why don't the Americans sell a fleet and say, no, we've got an American colony here, it's ours? They've got a little war going on in the United States at the time, right? 1862, the American Civil War. No one cares about some small, faraway island in the middle of the Pacific. So they let the Japanese have it. But this is incredibly important because Chichijima is the very first Japanese overseas colony. This is the very first Japanese overseas colony. So this is kind of the beginning, then, of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese Empire. One way that the Japanese are thinking they're going to keep the Westerners at bay is by physically expanding their borders, right? But they know that's not enough. They know if they are going to survive against the Europeans and the Americans, they need to get tough, they need to get strong. And what they do is they say, well, what has made them strong? What has made Europe strong? What has made the Americans strong? And the conclusion they come to is that all of those nations are deeply religious. Religion is incredibly important. They come to believe religion is important. Now, they themselves, of course, are not Christians, whereas the Europeans were. But they decide we need to have an energizing religious fervor that is going to kind of organize society. And so what they do is they kind of dust off these old institutions of emperor. Now, the Japanese had an emperor, and it was a title only. It meant nothing. Japanese title of emperor, by this point, meant nothing. It was just a ceremonial thing. They start to say, let's go back to ancient Japanese history and look at how important and big and special the Japanese emperor was back then, and we'll bring that back. And so essentially, they have this religion which places their emperor kind of at the center. They worship their emperor as almost a god on earth. But even that is not enough. The Japanese begin to say we need to be, not just with the idea of religion, but just generally we need to be more like the West. We need to be more like the West. So Japan begins a program to westernize itself, to become more Western. And it's very successful. In fact, today, in 2023, I'm perfectly comfortable saying, for all intents and purposes, Japan today is a Western nation. South Korea is a Western nation. They've completely Westernized. Now, they still have culture, and they still have some things that are distinctly their own. I don't mean to suggest that. But in terms of economic power, military power, all these things, they're thoroughly Western nations, right? The emperor at the time, when they make all these changes, the emperor at the time, his name is Meiji. The Emperor Meiji, which means enlightened rule. Enlightened rule. He was living in Kyoto, kind of an obscure figure, not much going on. But these new forces in Japan, these politicians in Japan, they kind of pluck him from this obscurity and they put him in a palace in Tokyo. Now, just as it had always been, real political power in Japan rested with the nobles, the daimyo. But now we have this figurehead that we hope will unite Japan, this idea of the emperor. On February 11th, 1889, February 11th, 1889, the Emperor Meiji, who was dressed in a Western military uniform, with the braids, and the epaulets, and the buttons, not a Japanese costume. This is a Western military uniform. He stands in front of his various government officials who all were wearing either Western-style military uniforms or they were wearing Western formal wear, suits and ties. The ladies of the court were wearing Western dresses. They weren't wearing the kimonos and whatnot. They were wearing Western dresses. And to these people, on February 11th, 1889, the Emperor Meiji announces a constitution. Bless you. A constitution. A constitution, another Western idea, another Western invention. But the constitution is very different from what we think of when we think of our Constitution in the United States. As Americans, our conception of a constitution, and many Europeans would agree with this, our conception of a constitution is a constitution. What is its primary role? What is the chief role of a constitution? And I'll tell you this right now. If you take nothing else from this class, take this. What is the chief purpose of a constitution? What a constitution does is it tells governments what it cannot do. A constitution says what a government cannot do. You cannot, the police can't just show up at your house in the middle of the night and drag you away, right? You can't do that. Constitutionally, you have rights. And we all hold those rights sacred. But sometimes, some people write constitutions, some countries write constitutions that sound good, because everybody likes a constitution. The idea of legitimacy comes from this idea of people participating in their governments. But the Japanese here, not unlike the Germans, when the Germans write their constitution in the 1860s, the Japanese write their constitution, and it is what we call a top-down constitution. A top-down constitution. It does just the opposite. It doesn't say what government cannot do. It says it's a gift from the emperor, which he bestowed on the country, and essentially it protects the rights, not of the people, but of the government. It says that the emperor is declared sacred and inviolable. The emperor was declared sacred and inviolable. He was the head of the empire. He is the head of the empire. He is the supreme commander of all armed forces. The supreme commander of all armed forces. He was the superintendent of all of the powers of sovereignty of the state. He's the superintendent of all of the powers of sovereignty of the state. And he is also, and like the Supreme Court, he is also the final arbiter of all laws. He's the final arbiter. So he gets to create the laws. He gets to rework laws. He gets to decide what the laws mean. The Constitution does not limit the emperor's power. The Constitution does not limit the emperor's power. The whole point of our Constitution is to limit the power of the government. That is the exact opposite of what the Meiji Constitution is doing here. It sets the emperor above the law. It sets him above the law. Japan, which had always been a militaristic society, is kind of enshrining that militarism here. It's saying that the warrior class, and that is to say the military, the modern military, the Army, the Navy, it states that Army and Navy leaders don't have to deal with civilian government. They can take their case directly to the emperor, and the emperor can rule on it. So essentially, the Army and Navy answer directly to the emperor. They don't answer to a civilian government. I mean, in theory they do, but the reality is, under the Constitution, they don't have to. They can go directly to the emperor. So in effect, what we'll see this means is the Army and the Navy themselves, in Japan, create kind of a shadow government. Their own government, like their own rules for themselves and their own ways of doing things here. Something very important is going to happen beginning in 1904 in Japan. 1904, we have the beginning of something called the Russo-Japanese War. The Russo-Japanese War. Russia and Japan go to war. Russia and Japan go to war. And that's, largely they're going to go to war because as Japan is expanding, as it is trying to gain new territory, so too is Russia. And they're competing in Asia. They're competing in Asia for different territory. At one point, Japan actually fights a war against China. They beat China. They get all this territory. And then Russia steps in and says, oh, Japan really shouldn't get all that territory. And all the other powers agree to back Russia because Japan wasn't white. right? Japan wasn't the right color. They shouldn't get all this territory. So they only got a little bit of territory. And then the theory was all this other territory would either revert back to China or something else would happen. But then, not long after that happens, there was a power vacuum. Russia just goes in and takes all this stuff that China had just won. So Japan had just won. So Japan is very upset with Russia. And so this leads to this war in 1904. The war lasts from 04 to 05. Japanese launch a sneak attack on the major Russian naval station called Port Arthur. Now, the Russians have the Baltic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, okay? So their Pacific Fleet is stationed at Port Arthur. This is a sneak attack that actually looks, on paper, a lot like the attack on Pearl Harbor. Of course, here we're not using aircraft. It's just the Japanese fleet heads toward the harbor and just starts bombarding the battleships while in port. But again, no declaration of war. The Japanese do not declare war. They just begin fighting. This war, the Russo-Japanese War, will soon become the largest war ever fought in world history to that point. Okay? In fact, 40 years earlier in the U.S. Civil War, you had some pretty big and bloody battles. But the battles you're going to see in the Russo-Japanese War just dwarf what happened in the American Civil War. It's just incredibly bloody, these wars that are fought. But one thing that happens too, one big thing that makes the Japanese quite happy is they completely destroy the Russian fleet in port, the Pacific Fleet in port. Well, the Russians have to respond to this. So what do? They get their Baltic Fleet, and they make arrangements with different countries for coaling stations, and they take that Baltic Fleet, they sail around Europe, around Africa, through the Indian Ocean, through the Pacific. They actually go up to the Straits of Tsushima, which are right between Japan and Korea. And as they get there, this fleet has just sailed all the way around the world. The Japanese slaughter them. The Japanese completely destroy the other Russian fleet. So Russia is completely humiliated. Now the problem is on land, the Japanese are generally successful on land. They're pushing the Russians back into Siberia. But here's the problem. As good as the Japanese army is, as much land as it's taking, it's simply not realistic that the Japanese army could push all the way to Moscow. Thousands and thousands of miles. They just don't have the power to do it, right? So what happens is after a few to give you a thing, the Battle of Mukden, which is fought in February and March of 1905, this is the largest battle the world has seen to that point. The Japanese killed about 97,000 Russian troops. I mean, it's just incredible. And because the Japanese just can't push all that way, they got to stop the war. But you want to know something, and this is a theme you will see in the Second World War. It is a relatively easy thing to start a war. It is not an easy thing to end a war. It is not an easy thing to end a war. A war is not a light switch. You can't just turn it on and off, right? And so both the Japanese and the Russians want to end the war, but they kind of don't know how. They kind of don't know how to stop it, right? Because if they say to the other side, we want to stop the war, the other side's going to say, we won, And they can't do that because that really hurts their ability to effectively negotiate an end to the war. So what they do is they both approach Teddy Roosevelt, who is the President of the United States. And they ask him to mitigate this. So I think representatives from Japan and Russia, I think they come to like Connecticut or something. And there they negotiate an end to the war. The U.S. confirms many of the gains that the Japanese had made in the war, though it doesn't accede to everything Japanese want. And what's going to happen is in subsequent generations, the Japanese are going to come to believe that it was the Americans that robbed them of greater victory in this war, when in fact it was the Japanese that had approached the United States about arbitrating. They will blame the Americans for saying we could have gotten so much more if the Americans hadn't gotten involved. So it's one of these kind of myths the Japanese are going to tell themselves that's going to contribute to their desire to go to war with America in 1941. Incidentally, Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to that war. However, Japan does get one significant concession from this war, this Japanese war, and that is Korea. Korea essentially becomes one of the most important Japanese colonies, territories, as a result of this war. Japan had kind of indirectly ruled Korea. Now it is firmly in charge of Korea as a result of this war. So Japan now is as much an imperialist power as Germany, as England, as all these other European nations were. Maybe bigger or smaller than some of them, but certainly it's an empire along the same lines as those other European empires here. But critically, one of the other really important things you have to know about the Russo-Japanese War, this is the first war in modern history where a non-Western nation defeated a Western nation. A non-Western nation defeated a Western nation. Meiji, the Emperor Meiji, was a capable emperor. He was capable. But kind of like the entrepreneur who makes millions of dollars, who starts a business, makes millions and millions of dollars, then leaves the business to his sons, and they run it into the ground. It's kind of like what happens with Meiji here. Yeah? The emperor's son, Meiji's son, was a guy by the name of Taisho. Taisho was physically frail, and he was mentally unbalanced. And for the last several years of his reign, he couldn't really rule, so his son kind of acted as his regent. Taisho dies in 1926. Taisho's son then becomes emperor, and his son is Hirohito. Hirohito, of course, will be the emperor of Japan until the 1980s. I think he dies in 1989. Now, in the early years of the 20th century, Japan's military, kind of the people that really fought in the Russo-Japanese War, they're starting to be replaced with the next generation. The next generation of officers are coming into play as the 20th century goes on here. And this new generation has different ideas about leadership, tactics, strategy, because the guys that fought in the Russo-Japanese War, they and their fathers, well, their fathers for sure, and a lot of them as well, had been samurai. Before the Constitution, they had been samurai. And there's a kind of a code of honor to being a samurai, right? There's kind of a code of honor to being a samurai. This new generation had never been samurai. They weren't brought up with those ideas, right? Rather, they're commoners. They had fought in the Russo-Japanese War as low-level commoners. And again, they kind of, like I said, they forget this idea that Japan was stopped more than anything else in the Russo-Japanese War. They were stopped by geography, right? It was the geography that kind of stops them. And they forgot about that. And this is, again, this myth about we would have gotten further if the Americans hadn't intervened. So this new generation, they begin to call themselves spirit warriors. Spirit warriors. And they start becoming a real force in Japanese society. Most of them are army, but also in the Navy as well. One of the things that they say to the emperor is, the government, in our government today, we have a cabinet position called Secretary of Defense. Underneath Secretary of Defense, we have two positions, Secretary of the Army and Secretary of the Navy. We have Secretary of the Air Force. We have different secretaries, right? Back then, here, it was usually just Army and Navy, right? Army and Navy. So you had, in the Japan at the time, you had a Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Navy. I don't know what their exact titles were, but essentially the ministers, right? War Minister, Navy Minister. And usually, in theory, you want these guys to be civilians. You want civilian oversight over the military. You want to be able to say to the military, no, you're going too far. No, you want too much. That's too much money, or we don't want to do that, right? But what happens is these spirit warriors that become so powerful, they begin to say to the government and to the emperor, We want active duty military officers serving as Secretary of War and Secretary of Navy. They want to completely cut out civilian oversight. They want this direct access to the emperor, and they get it. Many of the officers, if they didn't get it, they said, we'll resign, and if your entire officer corps resigns, your government's going to fall apart, right? This is a parliamentary system, right? And so, of course, they give it to them. So, your Army and your Navy officers, they can implement whatever policies they want to implement. Just as a little background, the Japanese wanted international recognition as an empire. They wanted to be on equal footing with the British, with the Americans, with the Germans when it came to acquiring overseas territory, to be treated like that. At the end of World War I, they're actually going to have a clause they're going to ask for a clause to be inserted in the Treaty of Versailles against any kind of racial discrimination. Okay? The Japanese are going to ask for a clause against racial discrimination. Now, be very careful here. They don't believe in equality of the races. They treat the Koreans like crap. To this day, there's a lot of anti-Korean racism in Japan, okay? They don't like other people. As we'll see in World War II, they will be absolutely murderous and barbarous toward other people. So they ask for this thing here. Every state the only reason they want it, again, is just so they are confirmed as being able to do the same things the Western powers are doing. But every power was willing to vote for this, except two powers don't, and they kind of had a veto over it. What two countries do you think rejected a statement on racial equality in 1919 at Versailles? What two countries? The United States does. Who was the president of the United States? Wilson. Wilson was a Southerner. He was a racist. He didn't want that to happen, right? What other country? Give you a hint. This country had a racist social policy until the 1990s. South Africa. South Africa. There's a great historian. He's my academic grandfather because my Ph.D. Advisor, this historian was his Ph.D. advisor. This is Paul Kennedy out of Yale. And he wrote a great book called The Engineers of Victory. The Engineers of Victory. So Kennedy here, he writes, quote, "The refusal of the West to agree to a racial equality clause regarding all peoples at Versailles, the British abandonment of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1922, the passing away of the old genro, the traditional aristocrats, somewhat like English Whigs in the Japanese government, the rise of new nationalist ideas about the country's special culture and special place in the world, the radicalization of the junior army officer corps, and the inherent weaknesses of the very top of the political system pushed Japan away from being a status quo power to being a revisionist power, just a few years ahead of Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy." What is a revisionist power? At the end of World War I, you essentially have, as he says, the status quo. Same as, right? It's Latin, same as. You have the status quo. Everything, people that were in power before World War I, they're going to be in power after World War I, at least on the winning side. We're the status quo powers. We're going to make sure the world is ordered how we want it, right? And they did that through the instrument of the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to order the world the way we want to order. But then you have these powers who are not happy with the Treaty of Versailles. They include people who are on the winning side of the war, the losing side of the war. Japan was on the winning side, but it's not happy with the world order as it emerges after Versailles. Germany was on the losing side. Certainly it's not happy. Italy was on the winning side, and it's not happy. And Russia just kind of went away, but it's not happy. The rape of Nanjing, was... like I said, the military trying to warn other Chinese cities don't resist. But it's so massive. It's just so incredibly brutal. Like I said, like I mentioned, these two lieutenants, they're having this contest, see who could get to 100. As soon as they got to 100, they kept going. And they said, let's see how many we could do. And then literally, they're just pulling people off the street and murdering them. And this was not just this kind of secret killing that was going on the rest of the world didn't know about. This contest was reported on in Tokyo newspapers. So the Japanese people know what is happening here. All right? They know what's happening here. There was a bunch of Westerners living in Nanjing at this time, people from Europe and America, and they saw what was happening, and so they negotiated with some of the generals to create something they called the Nanjing Safety Zone. And it was a few square blocks right in the middle of the city. And the idea was there was a school for girls and other things. They wanted to keep them safe. So the idea was if you're in the Nanjing safety zone, the Japanese army was technically not allowed to come into the Nanjing safety zone. And ironically, one of the greatest ironies of history is the leader of the Nanjing safety zone was a guy by the name of John Raba. John Raba was German, and he was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. Now, the Japanese did not have a lot of respect for Westerners. In fact, the Japanese kind of put it out there when they begin fighting and conquering territory in Asia and the Pacific. Their whole idea is we are liberating it. We're getting rid of the Western colonizers, Asia for Asians. In fact, they're just replacing Western colonizers, and they're far more brutal than the Western colonizers ever were. But that's the lie that they're saying. Oh, we're trying to liberate. We're trying to give Asia back to the Asians, right? So there's this anger, there's a contempt for Europeans and Americans, with the exception of Germans, because Germany and Japan, of course, were very friendly. And a lot of these Japanese soldiers would sneak into the safety zone and they'd grab women. They'd look for women and girls, right? And they would try to do that. Well, the Westerners would kind of patrol. They'd go around saying, you don't have a legal right to be here. Your government, your generals have said you do not have a right to be here. We're going to report you. A lot of the times, these Japanese would just club one of these Westerners upside the head or something like that. But when John Raba came out, he would wear a swastika armband. He'd point to a swastika and he'd say, you leave here right now. Yes, sir. It was like a talisman. His swastika was like a talisman that would get people to back away there. John Raba actually wrote a letter to Adolf Hitler, and he said, Mein Führer, these Japanese, they're causing all these problems, they're murdering all these people, this is terrible. And of course, it was not politically expedient for Hitler to do anything, so he ignored Raba's letters. Ironically, too, after the war, John Raba will go back to Germany just before the war starts, and after the war, he's like so many other Germans. He doesn't have a house, he doesn't have, his house has been bombed, he's starving, he doesn't know how he's going to make a living. And all these Chinese people that he had saved in China send him money, send him clothes, send him stuff, So, but this is just an absolutely horrible, horrible massacre, and this kind of gives us a little preview of what the Japanese are going to be like during the Second World War. Let's go ahead now and look at Italy. Now, Italy, of course, is one of the winners of World War I. It was on the victorious side of World War I. It was an ally. The Prime Minister of Italy, right here, is Vittorio Orlando. Now, but prior to World War I, Italy had actually been allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary. But when the war breaks out in 1914, Italy declares neutrality. It does not honor its treaty commitments to the Central Powers. It remains neutral. The next year, the Allies are courting Italy. They're trying to get Italy on the war on their side. So in 1915, Italy signs the Treaty of London, which essentially will make Italy an ally of England and France and Russia. The Treaty of London promised Italy would get a lot of territorial concessions. Specifically, Italy would get territory on the Adriatic coast, the Balkan Adriatic coast, which is good territory for ports and for naval efficacy. And these are very important concessions that the Allies were making to Italy during World War I after the Treaty of London. After the war, they have the Paris Peace Conference. They meet in Versailles here. And Woodrow Wilson, who is the President of the United States, he's going to be kind of a very important figure here during the Versailles Peace Conference. Now, he had actually, during the war, presented his idea for how we create peace. And his peace plan, he called the 14 points. The 14 points. But the problem is, the 14 points, among other things, calls for self-determination of peoples, meaning you should not have these extraterritorial empires like Austria-Hungary, which, Austria-Hungary wasn't just Austrians, right, who were ethnically German. You also had, of course, obviously Hungarians, but you had Slovaks, Slovenes, Romanians, Czechs. I mean, all these different, I mean, dozens of ethnic groups, right? And Wilson is saying you shouldn't have multinational empires because that way ethnic people, they can't attain their own goals, their own desires. So that's why you have the map of Europe redrawn. But part of that is saying we can't give Italy all this territory in the Balkans. These people are ethnically Italian. It wouldn't make any sense. This is in direct contravention of the whole reason Italy joined the war in the first place, to get that territory. So Italy is told, even though you are on the winning side, you are not going to get the spoils of victory. Even though you're on the winning side, you're not going to win. You're not going to get what you're promised. So this engenders a bitterness in the Italians. So even though they won, they didn't get what they were promised there. Because of this process, many Italians actually become disillusioned. And among other things, you have the rise of the Fascist Party. The rise of the Fascist Party. Fascist Party is led by Benito Mussolini. He had been, among other things, a teacher. He had been a newspaper editor and writer. And he had been, prior to World War I, a socialist. Meaning, he believed that a working man in Italy had more in common with a working man in Germany and France than he did with the rich people in his own country. And so he believed in this kind of socialist brotherhood, right? But as the war goes on, and he doesn't fight in the war, he joins the army, but I think he's wounded in a training accident. He goes to the hospital, and then he essentially gets out of the army. And he tells everybody, of course, he was at the front, and he lies about all that. But he creates this fascist party. In fact, he was called at one point the Lenin of Italy. But he actually becomes a nationalist. During the war, he becomes a nationalist. He leaves socialism, and he starts talking about Italy. Italy is great. Italy is great. And part of that, then, is he creates the Fascist Party. And they're also called the Black Shirts, because obviously they wore black shirts. That's what they were referred to. They were kind of an army of street fighters, of thugs that supported him politically. And in October of 1922... he feels he's got enough support. He kind of bluffs the government. He says to the government, if you don't make me prime minister, he says to the king, Emmanuel III, if you don't make me prime minister, there'll be a civil war. I'll order my fascists to tear this country apart. Now, this is a big bluff on Mussolini's part. He wasn't nearly as powerful as people believed he was, as he threatened people to be. But he makes that point. You put me in power, or this country will tear itself apart. We'll have a civil war. So the conservatives, the traditional conservatives, including the king, they back down, they accede, and they make him the prime minister. Now, initially, Italian fascism, more than anything else, was an economic model. It was an economic model. It was an economic model that appeared to create what he called a third way, or what they called the third way. Meaning, we're not communists, but we're not capitalists. And so they try to create this third way. It's often called corporatism, which essentially means we have different strata of society. We have factory workers, we have agricultural workers, we have intellectuals, we have bankers. And what we're doing is we're getting all of these people together, and we're selecting people from these different kind of groups, roughly based on your job, and then we're creating what they called the kind of their, for lack of a better word, their parliament. And so basically what it boiled down to is, in their parliament, there were three major groups. You had workers, you had industrialists, and you had the government. And so all those different jobs are kind of organized into where they would fit in these groups, right? So you have the workers, you have industrialists, wealthy people, and the government. And in theory, each one of these groups has an equal say in government. They can get together, they can voice their concerns, they can get things changed. But the reality is the industrialists and the government often work together to kind of project their interests at the expense of the workers. One of Mussolini's Do I have them up here? No. One of Mussolini's ministers here, his Minister of Justice, was a guy by the name of Alfredo Rocca. Alfredo Rocca. And he said, quote, "The fascist state has its own morality, its own religion, its own political mission in the world, its own form of social justice, in some its own economic arrangement." He also said that only through the state could a fascist citizen find well-being and fortune. So, fascism as it is created in Italy initially is about economics. It's about economics. But increasingly, the fascists are going to use violence and intimidation to govern. They're going to use violence and intimidation to govern. Strikes, workers striking, becomes outlawed. Intellectuals, writers, newspaper people, historians, professors, they are co-opted and they are forced to help glorify the state. Everything must be presented in terms of Italy being great. Early in the regime, if you opposed Mussolini, if you opposed the system, you would be exiled. You would be forced to leave your home. You would be forced to leave Italy. Now, and you see that the state increasingly engaging in what we think of in modern terms of propaganda. Radio is being really used here. Film, modern forms of entertainment news are being co-opted by the fascists to get their message out. Now, as I say, initially, fascism in Italy is economic. Initially, people are forced to leave the country if they oppose the regime. This is going to gradually change. In 1934, there's going to be an international fascist conference. Now, communist, socialists, they'd had the international for years, right? They'd had international people meeting for years. And fascism is much more state-oriented, right? Italy, Germany, these sorts of things. In 1933, of course, Hitler comes to power in Germany. In 1934, they decide we're going to have an international meeting of fascists. Now, there are fascist movements in other European countries, too. So they all come together. Now, the Italian fascists, when they arrive, they've got all these economic arguments laid out. We're going to talk economics. How can we not be fascist and not be capitalist? But when they get there, what they find is pretty much all of the other fascist movements, most notably Germany, but all the others, their fascism is less concerned with economics. I mean, it buys into some of this Italian economic theories, but it's less concerned with economics and much, much more concerned with race. With race. Setting the world in terms of this idea of racial hierarchy. Now, the Italians then are going to be caught up in this. And as the 30s go on and Italy draws closer to Germany, and initially there's a lot of friction between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, but once Hitler and Mussolini reach an accord, Italy becomes much more like Germany in that sense, where it becomes much more about race. Of course, whereas the Germans are saying, the Germans are the great race, the Italians are saying, the Italians are the great race. But you have those things build and occur there. And then increasingly, too, you have Mussolini being far more draconian with his political opponents. In fact, the very first time a political opponent of the fascists was murdered, it wasn't on Mussolini's say-so. It was just a bunch of his thugs that went out and did it. And he felt bad about it. He felt bad this guy got killed, this political opponent got killed, and he nearly resigned. But, he had too much of an ego ultimately to do it. So his black shirts are telling him, you need to give us more power to bust some heads. And Mussolini, kind of caving to his own, backers, gives them that power. He's afraid if he tells them no, they'll just get rid of him. So he gives them more power to be violent. And by, like I said, the late 1930s, the Italian fascists are incredibly violent, and they are incredibly much more influenced by the ideas of race as well. So now we're going to go ahead and going to take a look at what's going on in Russia. Now, Russia, of course, in the 19th century, Russia, of course, was very, very backward. It was not keeping pace with Western Europe. And in fact, they had serfs, which were a little bit better than slaves. They had a few more rights than slaves do. But in 1861, they get rid of their serfs. They abolish serfdom, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. They get rid of their serfs, and the problem is they don't give the serfs their own land, so many serfs start going into the cities. And many of these people from the country go to the cities. Cities start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they become slums, and working conditions are really bad. So conditions generally are very bad in Russia. Socialist movement, Russian socialist movement begins. Marx is translated into Russian. They begin reading Marx. And you have socialist movements in Russia. Bless you. And the biggest is the Russian Socialist Party, led by. It's not initially led by Lenin, but eventually it's led by Lenin. There was a split in the, and I'm not going to get into the politics here, but there was a split in the Russian Socialist Party. And you have two different branches. You had one branch that was called the Menshevik, which means minority, even though they were technically the majority. And then you have another branch that was called the Bolshevik, which means majority, even though technically they were the minority. It's typical communist doublethink and wordplay there, right? So the Bolsheviks are essentially communists, and the leader of the Bolsheviks is Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. The Tsar, the leader of Russia at the time, is Nicholas II. And the war, World War I, does not go well for the Russians. It's draining their resources. It's just causing all sorts of problems, and the people have had enough. And the people have been estranged from the Tsar for various events that had happened we're not going to get into. So there's no great love for the Tsar among the Russian people. And so finally, in March of 1917, in the middle of World War I, spontaneously, the people of St. Petersburg rise up. And this is what we call it. Like I say March. It's March in our calendar. It's February in the Russian calendar. So we call this the February Revolution. The February Revolution. This is a broad-based revolution where people just get up together to overthrow their government. They'd had enough. They get rid of the Tsar. And for a time, it looked like Russia was going. They create a provisional government. For a time, it looks like Russia is going to become a republic. That it's going to look like France or the United States. And America, it's one of the reasons America joins World War I, is they want to help Russia become a republic. However, by the fall, the provisional government had tried to stay in the war. It wasn't doing very well. The people were turning against it. So Lenin believes it's time to bring his movement to power. So in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks launch a coup. Now, the difference is, of course, a revolution is kind of a broad-based, everybody's rising up to overthrow the government. A coup is when you have a small number of people in government that take over the government. And that's essentially what Lenin's movement here is. They call it the October Revolution. In fact, it's a coup. The Bolsheviks seize key figures from the political opposition. They take over transportation and communication buildings. And they pretty much announce they are in charge now. Most of the Russian people were so disgusted with the way the provisional government was handling things, they accept this. They accept it. And you soon have a civil war in which red Bolshevik units are now fighting white Russians. And white Russians were everybody that opposed the Bolsheviks. People who were diehard monarchists to socialists that didn't like Lenin. All these people, the whole political spectrum, is against this. But they are unorganized, geographically separated. There's a lot of problems. And two, one of the big differences is in this war, Lenin is saying to the peasants, hey, when we win this war, you get the land. The land you're farming, you get that land. The whites, most of them are interested in returning the status quo. Oh, we've got to give these lands back to the nobles. So that's one of the reasons why the people tended to favor the Bolsheviks in this fight. Now, once Lenin is in power, he goes about creating a police state. And I'll tell you right now, if you ever want an image of communism burned into your brain, this is it. People being dragged into basements, having their brains blown out. That is what communists do. Whatever virtues they have, which are few and far between, they are murderers, and they conduct murders generally in secret. We see the first truly modern police state occurs here in Russia. The world's first truly modern police state occurs in Russia. The Bolsheviks organize a secret police force that is known as the Cheka. It's known as the Cheka. Eventually it will morph into the NKVD, the KGB, but when it starts, it's called the Cheka. The full name is like the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission to Combat Anti-Revolution and Sabotage. It's a big, long name, so we just call it the Cheka. Okay? And the head of the Cheka is this guy here, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Felix Dzerzhinsky. Felix Dzerzhinsky was known because supposedly he never felt pain. He was remarkable because he would end cabinet meetings by taking his cigar and putting it out on his own arm. And supposedly he never slept. Supposedly this man never slept. And Lenin tells him, I want you to create the secret police, and I want you to do two things. I want you to create an extraordinary system of violence. An extraordinary system of violence. And I want you to persecute the enemies of the revolution without mercy. I want you to persecute the enemies of the revolution without mercy. Extraordinary system of violence and persecute the enemies of the revolution without mercy. And that's exactly what they do. It's exactly what they do. One of the big targets of communist violence, initially and then later again under Stalin, the target is the kulaks. The kulaks. Now, Marx, when he writes the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, he hates peasants. He thinks peasants are stupid, uneducated. It's not for them. Communism is for the industrial proletariat. Workers who take the time to learn and to read. That's who communism is all about. The problem is Russia is primarily agricultural. You don't have a lot of industry. In fact, most the Mensheviks, they said we can't have communism until we fully industrialize. We have to be an industrial power before we can have communism. Lenin's saying, no. We can kind of abridge Marx. We can kind of skip some parts of Marx. We can just create a communist system and then educate people and then industrialize. And that was kind of one of the big philosophical differences between them. So, the kulaks, then, is kind of a way, they're targets because it's kind of a way of the communists transferring this idea of class warfare from kind of an urban proletariat idea to a rural idea. Kulaks were farmers that were a little better off than their neighbors. Maybe instead of just one cow, you have two cows. Maybe you have so much land that you have to hire somebody to come and work you to help you, grow and take care of all that land. If you hire someone, well, hell, you're exploiting them. You're a capitalist exploiter, right? So they go after the kulaks. And if you were one of these people that were a little bit off than your neighbors, there may be some resentment. So your neighbors will say, hey, that guy's got a lot of money, or he's done that, And essentially what the communists are going to do are punish people for being successful. They're going to punish people for being successful. And they're going to go ahead, they're going to go to these kulaks, they're going to arrest them. A lot of them will be, like this poor guy, taken into a basement and shot. And the lucky ones, well, maybe they're not so lucky depending on how you look at it, they will be sent to concentration camps. Gulags, concentration camps. And these are typically labor camps, and I'll explain more on that in a minute, but they go to these concentration camps. Stalin. Now, Lenin dies from a stroke in 1924. Somebody had actually tried to shoot him, or had shot him, rather. A woman had actually shot Lenin, and he recovers, seemingly, but then he has a series of strokes, and he dies in early 1924. Now, there's other people that try to succeed Stalin. The committees, they try to create political alliances. And Stalin actually comes out on top. He had a rival that nobody liked by the name of Leon Trotsky, who had been a Menshevik until right before the Bolshevik Revolution. He changed sides and became a Bolshevik. But Leon Trotsky was very famous, and most people thought, one of the big things that's on the minds of all the Russian revolutionaries is, are we going to have a Napoleon? The French Revolution ended with Napoleon. Are we going to have a Napoleon? And everybody thought Trotsky would be their Napoleon, because Trotsky was the head of the Red Army. He was smart, he was contemptuous. When other people were talking in the chambers, he'd be reading French novels and stuff. I mean, he didn't know how to schmooze. He wasn't a good politician. So everybody thought he's going to be our Napoleon. Well, they get rid of him. He's eventually exiled, and Stalin is able to come into power. In fact, it will be Stalin who will be the Napoleon of this revolution, but he doesn't come to power through military dictatorship, rather bureaucratic dictatorship. They put him in part of the party apparatus, so he essentially hires all these people in the Communist Party who are loyal to him. And he puts people in power loyal to him who support him. And that is the way that Stalin, in a brief, abbreviated manner, that's the way Stalin comes to power in Russia here. Now, here's the thing. Stalin has a mission. He sees himself as absolutely essential to bringing communism to the world. He sees himself as a figure like Marx, but perhaps even better maybe in his own ego. But every nation on earth, when they industrialize, the process of industrialization generally takes 30 to 40 years. The first country on earth to industrialize is Great Britain. Great Britain will begin the process of industrialization in 1780, and by 1820 we can say Great Britain has a fully industrialized economy. The next two nations on earth to industrialize were the United States and Germany. And the United States and Germany industrialized between about 1860 and 1900. By Marx's philosophy, by the philosophy of Karl Marx, it would have been Britain, then America, then Germany they would be the first countries on earth to go communist, right? Not backwater like Russia. So Stalin says we must industrialize. Part of this is communist philosophy. Communism is for industrialized nations, but part of it is for defense. Now, right at the end of World War I, the United States, Britain, and Japan had actually invaded Russia, briefly. And it didn't work, and it wasn't popular, and they pulled out. But all three of these countries briefly invaded Russia. That's stuck in the Russian mindset. The West is coming. The West is going to try to destroy us. The only way we can fight and defend ourselves is if we are industrialized. He is going to industrialize Russia, and in about 1927, 28, he announces something called the FiveYear Plan. The idea was, we're going to force-feed the machine, in 5 years we'll be fully industrialized. In any event, at the end of that 5 years, he says, we're going to have a new 5-year plan because we're not yet fully industrialized. After about 10 years, Russia will fully industrialize. After about 10 years, Russia will fully industrialize. But they won't stop with the 5-year plans. In fact, when the Soviet Union falls in 1991, they were on their 13th 5-year plan. So he just doesn't care about the human cost of industrialization. So part of this is the secret police, by this point, has been rebranded the NKVD, the Ministry of the Interior, NKVD. So the Cheka becomes the NKVD. And the NKVD is his police force. And under Stalin, as bad as things were under Lenin, and they were bad. Lenin was a bad dude. Don't ever let people get away with making excuses for Lenin. He was a bloodthirsty SOB. Things become much, much worse under Stalin. Much worse under Stalin. The secret police force, because we've got to industrialize, we have gulags, right? We have the gulags that are work camps, essentially. Well, we've got to fill these work camps. We've got quotas. So what do? We empower the NKVD, which runs the camps and also arrests people. You need to arrest more people. It gets to a point where if you are 5 minutes late for work, you're a saboteur. And you're arrested and you're sent to a camp. There was a report I read about a guy that was in the army, got his tank stuck in the mud, couldn't get his tank out. They had to bring a tow truck and pull it out. They arrest him. He goes 5 years into a concentration camp for that offense, right? People everywhere are accused of being secret spies and collaborators with the Japanese or the Germans or the Russians or the British, pardon me. So this becomes, people just disappear. You would go to school one day, and your class, one of your classmates would be gone, or your professor would be gone, or your boss would be gone, a coworker would be gone, your son would be gone, your father, your wife would be gone, and you don't talk about it. Molotov, who was the Soviet commissar foreign minister, Soviet foreign minister. His wife got arrested. Even he, right next to Stalin, even he wasn't immune. His wife, he lost his wife. She eventually was freed, but he didn't rock the boat. So the human costs of this economic miracle are absolutely catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. And the problem is a lot of these political prisoners, these people that aren't really guilty of anything, they go to prisons, and they are victims, they are preyed upon by actual hardened criminals, rapists, murderers. They actually take advantage of these political prisoners who are decent, generally decent people, or certainly no worse than most of us. One major project they construct is the White Sea-Baltic Sea Canal. It's of marginal economic value, but Stalin's obsessed with it. It is staffed by laborers from these camps, and the conditions were terrible. Equipment is virtually non-existent. In fact, most of the people that dig this canal dig it with their hands. They use their hands to dig this canal. But over 100,000 people die digging this canal. Over 100,000 people die digging this canal. Stalin intensifies the war against the kulaks. He institutes a policy called collectivization, saying, now remember, the Bolsheviks in the war, they told people, you can have your own land, you can have your own land, you can have your own land. Now they're saying, hey, we got an even better idea. Let's let everybody pool their land together. We'll have these big collectivized farms. And then you can work together. Well, as you can imagine, he forces it to go through, and it has the predictable results. Each of these farms, like, they give them a tractor. Oh, you got a tractor. You didn't have a tractor on your individual farm, but now everybody, one day a week, this guy can take a tractor, and that guy can take a tractor. Guess what? Tractor breaks down suddenly. Who broke the tractor? Well, I didn't break the tractor. No one takes responsibility. And that's what happens when you kind of collectivize things, right? So Soviet agriculture, which wasn't doing amazing to begin with, is now doing even worse because of this process of collectivization. Those who resist collectivization, now in theory you have a choice. In theory you can reject collectivization, but the reality is you are hounded, you are terrorized, you are threatened, and in some cases, yes, you are shot or put into a camp if you don't collectivize. The grain then is collected, and most of it is taken from the farms and the countryside to feed the cities and to sell on the world market. Because guess what? Industrialization ain't cheap. If we want to build these power plants and dams and stuff, we need money to do it, and the only thing we've really got to sell is our food. So Russia, the Soviet Union, is selling its food in order to pay for all this stuff. This leads to severe problems, particularly in the Ukraine. You wonder why there's this animosity between the Russians and the Ukrainians to this day that is partially responsible for this war, we're saying? It's because the Soviet Union treated Ukrainians like crap. In some cases, they treated Ukrainians like the way a lot of Americans, at the same time, treated their ethnic minorities, African Americans. They looked down on them, they treated them like crap. And Stalin was responsible for an entirely preventable, man-made human disaster, and this is a famine that lasts for a couple of years, beginning about 1932, and we call this the Holodomor. The Holodomor. The Holodomor. And you can see these are victims here who starved to death. You can see the faces there of the Holodomor. There was an account, Timothy Snyder wrote a great book called Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. Great book. And he talks about this, and he talks about the story about there's these nuns who had an orphanage, and there was no food, so they're literally taking all these children from village to village, trying to get them food. And at one point, one of these nuns looked back, and some of the boys are missing. And so she runs back to find them. And what she finds is that 2 or 3 of these bigger boys are holding down a smaller boy, and they are literally ripping his flesh from his body to eat. And the child who was being victimized here began doing the same, ripping flesh from his own body to eat. You're hungry enough. Estimates state that anywhere, low-end estimate is about 2.6 million Ukrainians starved to death. The high-end estimate is as much as 10 million starved to death. Not a lot of good records, so we don't know for sure. But this is absolutely, absolutely barbaric. Any time anyone would say to Stalin, hey, we're kind of going too far here. We're kind of going too far. Stalin would call them a right deviationist. You're too far right politically. You're a right deviationist. And guess what? If you're labeled a right deviationist, you're going to lose your job. You might get that. You might go to a camp. Not a good thing to be, right? Now, one thing Stalin does, too, is Stalin is paranoid. He's paranoid. And he knows the only real... He has political opponents, or at least political people he's suspicious of, within the Communist Party. But he's very scared of the Red Army. Because the Red Army has potentially the power to overthrow him. And it's really the only institution in Russia that would be powerful enough to do it, right? So, beginning in 1937, we have something called the Great Terror, or the Purge. And he arrests a number of party members and has them, again, many of them just lose their jobs. Some of them get shot or go to camps. He does that to a lot of his political opponents, but he also does it to a number of Red Army officers. Now, here is a photograph in the 30s. These are the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union. And Voroshilov here is going to be one of Stalin's big cronies. So is Boudinny there. But this guy here is Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, and this is kind of germane about World War II and military history, he is essentially working on the same kinds of ideas of tactics that the Germans are working on that eventually we'll call blitzkrieg. He refers to these kinds of operations as deep operations. He calls them deep operations. And it's essentially the same thing. He's working on that. Stalin doesn't like that. Stalin doesn't like this guy. He's got personal reasons for not liking this guy, but just overall he doesn't like this guy. So when this purge happens, 3 of those marshals, exceptions of Voroshilov in the bottom center and Boudinny top left, 3 of those guys are executed. They're executed. So the best generals that Stalin has, he's liquidating. He's getting rid of, right? And he tries many more, fires many more. In all, about 33,000 Soviet officers are relieved of command. 33,000 Soviet officers are relieved of command. About 7,000 of them were arrested. And of those that were arrested, again, a lot of them were shot or go to concentration camps. One of the great generals, one of the greatest generals of World War II is Konstantin Rokossovsky. And Rokossovsky at this time goes to a concentration camp. Now, when the Germans invade in 1941, the Russians are pulling all the guys that know anything about military to put them out there. And Stalin pulls back in Rokossovsky, and he says, "Oh, Rokossovsky, where have you been?" "Well, I was in a camp. You knocked out all my teeth." "Oh, well, hey, good to have you back. Let's get you out there." Stalin knew exactly where this guy'd been. He'd signed the orders to send him to a concentration camp, okay? But that's just kind of the sadistic mind that Stalin had here. Well, they had army. The Russian army, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that should get credit for. In World War I and again in World War II, Russian artillery was second to none. The artillery services in Russia, they knew what they're doing. Artillery was always really good in Russia. But the whole organization, the problem with World War I is the army was really organized prior to World War I, not as a military force to go invade and fight. It was really more than anything a constabulary. It was a police force to police this vast Russian empire. And by World War II, the problem is it's so political. As we'll see, every military unit has to have a political officer. Now, anybody who's ever been in the military will tell you, you want one person in command, one person making the decisions. When you put a political person, suddenly got 2 people, and if they disagree, there's problems, right? So political officers are not a good thing, and yet it's just so heavily politicized. And there's other reasons we'll see for the Soviets, their poor showing at the beginning of the war. So, yeah. But this is a big one. You get rid of all your competent people. Virtually most of the people that are still in the army, not all of them, because you still have some competent people that remain, but a lot of your people that are fighting on that front line are just incompetent. They're just incompetent. But they're politically reliable. And that's the important thing, right? Unless you're fighting a war. In fact, one of the reasons why Hitler is going to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 is precisely because he believes the Soviets will be a pushover because they got rid of their best generals. That was a factor in Hitler's thinking there. Throughout World War I, Germany's military and political leaders were saying, we're this close. We're this close. One more big push and we'll win the war. We'll win the war. So they're constantly being told this. Right up until the end of the war, the German people were led to believe they were going to win. They're right there, they're going to win. German people invest heavily in the war. Their life savings they put into buying war bonds to keep the war machine going, believing we're going to win the war. They don't win the war. Spoiler alert. They lose the war, and the people in Germany cannot understand it. They can't understand. How did we lose? Our army was still in France and Belgium. We weren't fighting in Germany. How did we beat Russia? They knocked Russia out of the war. How did we lose? And so they begin to develop this idea called the stab in the back theory. We didn't really lose in a fair fight in the battlefield. We lost because there were Jews and communists at home that didn't want us to win, that for their own purposes didn't want us to win. So this becomes a very important myth in Germany, the stab in the back theory, the stab in the back theory. Now, at the end of the war, the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, abdicates, and they create a provisional government with the intention of creating a republic. The Allies meet in Paris in 1919, and the idea was Woodrow Wilson and France and England and Italy, they were going to get together with about 30 other nations that were on the Allied side for about 2 or 3 weeks to figure out kind of what they wanted out of the peace, and then they would meet and negotiate with the Germans. That was the theory. The reality was, when the Allies get together, they haggle and barter for about 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, they've got their treaty. When they invite the Germans in, it's not to negotiate, it's to say, sign. And if you don't sign, we will invade Germany, and we will tear Germany apart. We will make 5 or 6 small German states. Do you want that, or do you want your country? Because if you want your country, sign. Of course, the Treaty of Versailles is incredibly punitive. Germany is limited to a 100,000-man army. They lose their colonies overseas. They lose territory in Europe. They're forbidden to build submarines or military aircraft or tanks. And of course, they're forced to pay for the war, roughly $33 billion. The schedule they had worked out had Germany completing their payments in the year 1988. 1988. It should be noted, as punitive as the Treaty of Versailles is, as punitive as that treaty is, it's not nearly as punitive as the treaty Germany made Russia sign at Brest-Litovsk in 1918, just a year earlier. They took like a quarter of Russian population, tons of their coal, like 90% of their coal and other resources. So Germany was always screaming, this treaty is so punitive. Well, they had a pretty punitive treaty against Russia a year earlier. So the republic that is created is incredibly unpopular. It's incredibly unpopular, and for years it struggles with significant economic problems. As I say, during the war, Germans had bought war bonds. They paid for war bonds. When Germany lost the war, all these bonds were worthless. All of these bonds were worthless. The middle class was wiped out economically. Middle class was wiped out economically. And in 1923, the government tries to pay off its debt by printing more money. It just says, let's just print money, which is always a good thing. What does that lead to? Inflation, right? In this case, hyperinflation. Hyperinflation. It gets so bad that the inflation. There's a story. There's this guy who you'd have to get paid right after work every day, because if you waited a day, your money would be worthless. So this guy gets paid, and they're printing trillion-mark bills, right? This guy has a wheelbarrow full of his cash. He goes to a store, he darts inside the store to see if they've got what he needs. When he comes back, his cash is scattered all over the ground. Somebody stole the wheelbarrow. It was worth more, right? You see this guy here, what is he doing? He's making wallpaper out of marks. It's cheaper than wallpaper, right? So once again, with the hyperinflation, Germany's middle classes, they're wiped out economically. They were wiped out in 1919 when they lost the war. They lost all that money in the war bonds. That was all their savings. They start their work hard. They save. And then in 1923, this hyperinflation kicks in. They lose all their life savings again. They're wiped out economically twice. In 1924, the government starts to stabilize. The United States steps in. We have the Dawes Plan, where the United States can loan money to the German government. That stabilizes their currency. Things start to look good. In fact, the years 1924 to 1929 we consider to be the golden age of the Weimar Republic because it looks like the Republic's going to succeed. It looks like the Republic's going to succeed. But then, the Great Depression, 1929. Everybody, everywhere, loses their life savings, except Russia. Soviet Union's doing okay. Their economy's not tied to the market. But every other nation that is tied to the market, everybody's wiped out. Now, I want you to think about this. The German middle class, 3 times in 10 years, lose everything. They lose their life savings 3 times in 10 years. When that happens, they're thinking, oh, we have this democratic system. You know what? It's not working. And when you think, I don't have money to send my kid to school. I don't have money to buy my kids shoes. I don't have money to put food in their bellies. You don't care so much about things like voting. You don't care so much about things like free speech. It doesn't matter. What matters is that your kid survives, is happy, is healthy. That's what matters. So what happens is, you could say, when you are devastated economically like this repeatedly, your moral compass just starts going all over the place, right? It's not pointing to true north anymore. More Germans, of course, they blame the Jews, they blame the communists. The Jews were a minority that had always been marginalized in German society. They've been violently murdered during the Black Plague and during the Crusades. So they blame the Jews. They blame the Social Democrats, which created the Republic. They were kind of a just left-of-center party that created the Republic. So the Nazis, they're blaming these people, and they say, you put us in power, we'll bring you peace, stability, greatness for our country once more. And they would do that in fun ways. They'd say to farmers, we're going to make sure you get more money for your crop. When you send your crop in, we're going to make sure you get more money. Then they go into the cities and they'd say, we're going to make sure food prices come down. You know, whoever they talked to, whatever message they wanted to hear is what the Nazis would say. In January of 1933, after political negotiations, the president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, he appoints Adolf Hitler the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP. That's the official name of the Nazis. The Nazis did not call themselves Nazis. They called themselves National Socialists. Hitler is appointed to be the leader, or the chancellor, which is like the prime minister. So the president, Paul von Hindenburg, he is the head of state. Hitler now, as chancellor, is the head of government. Now again, in America, we don't have that distinction. It's just the same thing, right? It's president of the United States. But in England, your head of state is the king. Your head of government is the prime minister. Same thing here. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. Of course, they set up things largely along Soviet lines. That is, with regard to the police state, they set up their own concentration camp system, beginning with Dachau in March of 1933. They set up their own secret police force, the Gestapo. Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, which eventually the Gestapo will be incorporated into, he said flat out, Felix Dzerzhinsky was kind of his exemplar, the person that he followed. He says what the Soviets, their concentration camps were the inspiration for his. To give you an example, in 1939, the year World War II begins, there were about 20,000 people in German concentration camps. About 20,000 people in German concentration camps. There were over 1 million in Soviet camps that same year. There were over 1 million in Soviet camps. In the summer of 1934, they signed the Enabling Act. They have the fire in the Reichstag, and they signed something called the Enabling Act about a month after Hitler comes to power, which pretty much gives him unlimited power. Hitler pretty much has, even though his only real check on power is the president. Paul von Hindenburg, who's in his 80s, he's older, he's doddering, he's the only check on Hitler's power. Other than that, he's got pretty much total power. Concentration camp, first concentration camp at Dachau, 1933. The Gestapo was created in 1933 as well. And then in 1934, the summer of 1934, Hitler kind of has his own purge. He has his own purge. He had a street army, an army of street thugs that had helped him maintain political power, but now they started making demands. Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the brown shirts here, he wanted to be the war minister. The army didn't like that, and Hitler kind of needed the army on his side. So in the summer of 1934, over a weekend, he essentially kills a number of people in his own party, beginning with Ernst Röhm here. He kills Ernst Röhm and the rest of the SA leadership. He kills conservatives that disagreed with him. He has them murdered. In all, he murders probably somewhere around 200 to 300 people, although the exact number is still somewhat elusive. And in exchange for this getting rid of Röhm and the other figures, the army agrees to support Hitler. The army agrees to support Hitler once Hindenburg dies. And exactly a month later, Hindenburg dies. Hindenburg dies in August of 1934, and the army supports Adolf Hitler. It says, "We will support you." So Hitler takes the office of president and chancellor, and he creates a new office called Führer. Führer. The German military begins to, or Hitler rather begins to remilitarize Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had placed a number of limits on the German army. He begins to disregard them. He would say things publicly like, well, we've only got a 100,000-man army, but France has a much larger army. We'll be okay with our 100,000-man army if France will go down to a 100,000-man army. And of course, that's not going to happen. So he kind of plays on that, We just want what's fair. We just want what everybody else has. And he kind of gets a lot of sympathy from a lot of people saying, he's not wrong. That a lot of people would say that, and so that he'd be able to get away with this stuff. In 1935, he begins to cast off the treaty limits. He increases the size of the military. He creates the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. The Rhineland was a territory in Germany. He sends his army back in there. According to the treaty, he couldn't put military units in there. He did put military units in there, and the French don't stop him. The French have their own political problems. They got communists in their government they're dealing with. They don't think they can afford it. So Hitler pulls this off, and as he pulls off these coups, the German people are thinking, look at what this guy's doing. Even if I didn't like Hitler, I didn't vote for him, I kind of appreciate what he's doing, right? So he starts to get a lot of broad popular support. And one thing about Hitler is he always depends on popular support. In fact, if you had a free election in Germany between the time Hitler came to power until about 1933, or 1943, he would have won in a landslide. It's only when the bombings really start taking hold in Germany that the people start turning against Hitler. German military spending begins to skyrocket. In 1933, it was about 1 billion marks. In 1935, they were spending 5 billion marks. In 1937, they're spending 10 billion. In 1939, 30 billion. So you can see this almost exponential growth in how much we're spending on the military. 1933, 1 billion, 1935, 5 billion, 37, 10 billion, and 39, 30 billion. You don't spend that kind of money on a whim. And all things being equal, you're probably preparing for a war.